We need to talk. Hello and welcome back. If you do not know me, I am Scarlett. If you do know me, I am sorry. Today, we are here to talk about representation in media, especially as it is Pride Month. We're going to do representation versus fetishization of the queer community. Before we get too far into it, I do know that not everyone who falls on the LGBTQIA+ umbrella likes the word queer, which is understandable as it was used as something to be harmful in the past and has since been reclaimed. But I am going to use it for this video, and I just wanted to acknowledge that I know that no one word can represent an entire community or everybody's feelings and experiences, and I don't want to alienate or hurt anybody. That's not my intention, but it is the word I'm going to use for this video, and let us get into it, shall we? There are more queer characters in media today than ever before, and objectively, that is a very good thing. It's also not a particularly high metric to hit. Queer characters have not usually been a big part of the small or large screens in decades past. If they were, it was usually as a comic relief character, the one who dies, or as a villain. Tropes like the depraved homosexual and bury your gays are so popular they became, well, tropes. There's a lot of similar avenues of discrimination walked today. For example, the idea that drag queens are going to sexualize and groom your children, or that gay or queer teachers, non-binary teachers usually with tattoos and dyed hair, are going to teach your kids about sex and, I don't know, make them gay or something, which I still don't fully understand how that makes sense, but that's something that people think. So it's important that we address these things because it doesn't just affect media, it also affects our reality. Savvy Rights Books just put out a really good video about Ron DeSantis and Disney and all of the weird homophobic stuff that's just been going on there. I think I'm going to try to do something a little bit later this month, but she went so very in depth, I almost don't even know if there's more to cover on it, but I'm going to do sort of an abridged version, I think, so I will talk about that, but for more, I would go check out her video. I'll put her video linked down below, because I think it's just something really important to look at, and it does talk a bit about how all of this affects reality. But to keep it short here, people loathe queerness, or maybe they just fear it. Whether homophobia is wrapped in a softer, more palatable blanket of religion, or thrown like rocks, we know a large portion of the population would rather blend the rainbow into a starker sky than to accept that queer people exist. We can see exactly this in the situation where Bud Light partnered with Dylan Mulvaney, the actress and TikTok star who educates the public on transgender issues from her own perspective as a transgender woman. People were shooting beer cans and running them over with their Ford pickup trucks, which is ironic considering Ford made a very gay truck back in 2021 when faced with similar accusations of, I guess, supporting gay people? I don't know.
It might taste like piss from a hamster, but it gave us a cheap buzz.
If you don't like it, there's a fucking door.
To bring this back into the media space, we have a long history of taking distasteful characters and making them people to laugh at, vilify, or to give social brownie points, just to throw in your random queer character and say ooh, look, I got one. I can't tell you how many times I've read things or heard stories on audiobooks or whatever, or even just look at movies. There's so many movies where the villains are fat, because apparently that's just something we don't like, and instead of taking a solid, healthy approach to the situation and being hey, why don't we just try to add diversity to our cast of characters and make people just exist as they are? It's no, we don't like when people are fat because that doesn't fit in with the ideal society that we have in our heads. So we're just going to make them the bad guy and say, hey, don't be that person. If we want to take a more serious look at this, we can think about the Covenant School shooting back in March of this year and how the shooter was trans. And that's something that happens to be true, right? I think this is a much bigger conversation, but most school shooters are white men or white boys, and we don't ever focus that attention on that, oh, look at this white boy who committed this crime. It's always just I don't know, either on mental health, which is important, or gun rights, which is important, but it's not on the demographic of that person. Yet when this shooting happened, a huge portion of media attention was on the fact that this individual was transgender. And so we take the one person and they all of a sudden represent an entire community, which is just not how it is. It's a person who is trans, but does not represent everyone who is trans committing a horrible, horrible crime. And so I think that that's why it's important that we recognize when we see this in entertainment media, because then we see it in news media and in reality, and it's just one of those things where it's another form of homophobia, right? Or of queer phobia, of just transphobia. It depends on the population, but we see it in this case with being, transgender as the person who committed this crime, but it's not an isolated incident, and it's not only related to transgender issues. And that's not to say that villains can't be queer or fat. Queer people can be villains because regular queer people can be bad people because they're people. I think that's sort of something that gets lost a lot of the time. It's like, women can be bad, and it's not because they're women, it's because people are bad and women are people. It's one of those weird market segments of thinking that we have to separate, the people we're championing who are, disenfranchised in some way, and saying that they can't be bad because, look, you're saying that, we need to lift them up or whatever. It's like, no, people can just be bad because people are people, as long as we acknowledge that they're not bad because they are part of a disenfranchised population. I have a bunch of links down below in my little link, and I also have an article associated with this video listed down below, so everything is listed and linked within its paragraph. So if you want to take a look at some more information about this, you can find it there. And that's true of almost every video I have, so if you're interested, just so you know. But I think it's just something that we need to discuss, because it's more a matter of, hey, you don't fit into the social norm that I think we should have, so we're going to make you the villain so people know not to be like you, not to be fat, not to be queer, not to be whatever we don't like as a society. And we've done that for a really, really long time. I mean, hell, we can look at Ursula, who I really love as a villain. I think lots of people love her, but she is fat and queer-coded, which is basically undertones that kind of offer the idea of queerness without saying it outright, which makes sense because she was in fact based on a drag queen, Divine. And like I said, I really love Ursula. I think that she's one of the most entertaining, dynamic villains that we get because she has such a big personality, and she's just unapologetically Ursula. And while that's awesome, and I think that in a perfect world, she would be a great villain just to exist, we have to look at the fact that she's the only outwardly queer-coded character in Ariel. I've read some things saying that Ariel as a whole is sort of, could be looked at as an allegory for queerness because it's coming to a new realization, a new part of life, wanting to be something that you are not seen as and not being allowed to. There's a whole discourse about that. But generally, outwardly, Ursula is the only queer-coded character in the movie. And having her be the villain makes it seem like, oh, look at this person, this is who you should not strive to be like because she's the bad guy. And so while her character is super cool, we also have this other side of the conversation that says, this is the one you want to avoid being. So don't be fat, don't be queer, don't be Ursula. And I don't know if that was the intention really. I think that probably it wasn't. But because of the way that our media and society operates, it's just something that happens because we don't have enough of those actual important queer characters throughout the story. So let's take a bit of a turn, because I want to talk about, in this whole situation, fetishization versus representation, right? So what exactly is fetishization? Fetishization happens when the focus of a person is not on the individual, but on the aspect of their queerness, in this example. Or, in general, on the aspect of one part of their being. So it's not focusing on the person, it's focusing on a part of their identity. Fetishization is not, of course, limited to the queer community. And we see it a lot of times in different aspects of the BIPOC community. So when people say things like exotic, or call people with brown skin like chocolate, or any kind of like food item, which you've seen a lot probably in foundation colors and stuff, almond or whatever. Like there's a whole bunch of like mocha. That's not good. It's more like, I don't know, there are different aspects of fetishization, so it's maybe not as blatant as some other things might be. But those are other examples of fetishization of people based on one aspect of them as a person. For now, though, I do want to focus on queerness, although there can be crossover here, obviously, because we want to make sure these conversations happen with intersectionality in mind. So, if you're a queer person who is also a BIPOC person, it's probably going to be amplified, right? Like there's going to be different aspects of fetishization in both camps, and things are probably going to cross over. So that's something I want to make sure we acknowledge. I'm trying to keep this conversation like just basic, for right now, just as a foundational level. Foundation, because we were just talking about makeup. Anyway, but I do want to make sure that we acknowledge that these sorts of things are true, because we can't have these conversations without being intersectional, because that's just not right or accurate. So technically, fetishization is related to a sexual objectification of people based on one aspect of their existence and identity, but I would argue that that is not an isolated situation. I think that we can see this in like the gay best friend era that we had in like the early 2000s to 2010s, where it was more a focus on like, hey, let's hop in the car, we're gonna go talk about boys and go shopping, and like, I want a gay best friend, and it's like, not, hey, I like this person, and this person is gay, just as a fact. It's, I want specifically a gay best friend so that we can talk about boys and like do all these things that, you know, were more effeminate, which isn't necessarily inaccurate for some people, but that's not universally true. Like, not every gay person likes talking about boys and shopping. That's just, it's a stereotype. Some maybe do, and that's fine, but we can't like make one experience a universal experience. And so I would argue that the fetishization happens not necessarily sexually in that case, but just as, like, I care more about what you are than who you are. I also want to make sure, you know, to acknowledge that it's totally fine to have, like, a gay side character or a gay best friend character in media, so long as they're treated as an actual person and not the idea of a person. And also, if they're a side character, that there are other queer characters that exist. You know, that it's not them being relegated to like an almost off-screen, barely there representation sort of character. So basically, the whole point of my argument is that if there's a dehumanization aspect, then that could also coincide with fetishization. I think this brings an important aspect to our conversation, which is the way that we look at people in general. Gay people, disabled people, black people, there are all these qualifiers of people, and while they can be helpful in like sociological discussions or cases like this where we're talking specifically about, you know, queerness and queer people and their spaces in media, when we talk about them in general, if we're using those qualifiers, it takes away and detracts from, you know, people's ability to just be people, if that makes sense. So why do we need these qualifiers if we're not looking in those contexts? It's not to help the conversation, it's to other people. Like, there's a difference between saying, my disabled friend Jim needs a ramp, and, yo, my buddy Jim needs a ramp for his wheelchair. When we put the othering factor first, it takes away from somebody's human existence. It makes them feel less like a person and more like a sort of person. Like, would you ever say, hey, this is my straight, white, able-bodied friend Diane? No. That sounds really weird. And I think we've largely gotten away with saying things like, this is my lesbian friend Jane. But I think that some people still do it, and sometimes the focus still is on the queerness of a person as opposed to the person who exists in reality. If you have a hard time understanding why this is an issue, think about it if you were to like put any other part of a person's existence ahead of their name, like, hey, this is my violist friend Pam. That's only relevant if you're talking to someone who maybe runs an orchestra or who also plays an instrument, and you're talking about violins or violas or whatever. Like, it's only relevant if the conversation makes it relevant. Otherwise, you're going to be like, hey, this is my violist friend Pam, and everyone's like, cool. This is like a retirement lunch. So I think that we need to make sure we acknowledge that those sorts of qualifiers are only necessary if really relevant and pertinent to the situation at hand. Otherwise, they only serve to other people, which is not humanizing and leads more into the fetishization of a person than to representation. I want to talk a little bit now more specifically about the MLM slash fiction, and that's men loving men, not multi-level marketing, even though more often than not I'm watching videos about multi-level marketing. But this case, no, it's about the other MLM. And slash fiction specifically related to that, even though, as we'll get into in a bit, it does exist in a broader sense. Let's just delve in. So slash fiction, otherwise known as slash fic, is a reference to the fanfiction community, and it's more in the way that it's formatted. So if you're talking about two characters in a relationship, it's usually like X character slash other character, and that means that they are romantically involved, as opposed to like the and sign, which is usually like friends or whatever. So it's more a reference to the way that it's laid out in fanfiction websites, but it has come to sort of represent this situation of characters who are romantically involved, who oftentimes are not actually involved romantically in the canon or the original piece of media. For the purpose of this conversation, like I said, we're going to focus on the male character slash male character, because that tends to be where this conversation gets a little bit tricky. But it does exist just as like women and women, or like, you know, if there's non-binary characters, or sometimes people make characters into non-binary characters, or heterosexual couples, like all kinds of things. But we're going to focus on the MLM side of it right now. It's no secret that in the fic space, in the fandom space, most of these sorts of slash fics that we're talking about right now are written by women. And I don't think this is inherently bad. There's a lot of discussions as to why it is that women would prefer to write these sorts of things, and that does lead into our conversation about fetishization. But there are other aspects that I think are just worth highlighting, whether or not they're 100% true. I think the fact that that's like what's out there is just important to note. And they are male characters are often more developed in canon works. So because we've got this history of having male characters be protagonists more and having them have more depth, it's just easier to like ship, which is to pit people in a relationship with each other, I guess you could say. Sometimes it's friendship, but most of the time in this context we're talking about romantic relationships. So it's easier to ship characters who already have like better backstories and more character development. And so in some instances we could think that, you know, it's better and easier to write these sorts of things when both characters have some sort of backstory. Because relationships and history are already better explored, which just lends itself to better writing. And also more chemistry. Because even if an existing relationship in the canon work is male-female, it's really hard to kind of get involved and get invested if the female character is like puddle deep, you know? Another aspect of this is that LGBTQIA+ queer representation in media is so minimal that people have to create it. And I think another aspect of the conversation that's necessary here is that so many people get mad at the male/male writing community. And it's like, is that in itself an aspect of homophobia, where you're unhappy because you don't... Like, I've seen a lot of arguments about people who are like, those characters aren't gay. Why are you writing them to be gay? They're clearly not gay when it's not stated. Or if it is, it's like, well, they are in fact fictional characters. So it doesn't really hurt to write them that way because they're just not real. But there are issues with this whole kind of argument, like why is it that women predominantly, and this isn't all women, but just that there are a huge portion of women who predominantly like to write these MLM fics as opposed to heterosexual fics, or even like women loving women WLW fics. And I think that's the part of the conversation that trickles down into our fetishization representation situation here. Because I can't argue that we need more representation in media, in canon media, so that, you know, we can have good queer couples together. And I'm not here to defend slash fic. I know that kind of sounded like I was, but I think it was just important to bring up those sorts of ideas before we get into why it's problematic. And like I said, not inherently problematic, but I do think that, you know, when there are specifically gay men who have issues with this being written, that it's important to listen to what they're saying and why. And before getting even further in, I know I keep stopping myself, I think that we have to address just a couple more things, because this anti-slash, so people who are against like the slash fics happening argument, some of them are just really weird. One, there's some kind of weird idea that both fanfics in general, but specifically slash fics, are all like smut, which is not true. And even if it is, I think as long as it's kept out of like kid spaces, which is why on lots of fan fiction websites you can like exclude certain kinds of like explicit material or whatever, as long as it's kept out of like kid spaces, who cares? You know, like it's whatever. But it's also not true, like they're not all smut, so that's one thing. And another one that I've seen a couple times is like people getting mad at writing characters in alternate realities, so stories that maybe aren't theirs, or like if it's a story that involves magic, bringing them into the real world and doing like a coffee shop AU or something like that. I've seen people get really mad about that, and I'm like, why? I mean, it's time to, I think, employ the standard statement of the fandom communities, which is don't like, don't read. But now that we've addressed those things, let's get into the other side of this, which is neither of those things are the problem with slash fic. But what is some of the issues that I do think have improved in the last 5 to 10 years. I think a basis of the issues that we saw were in that like gay best friend sort of era. And I'm not saying they haven't followed through, but a lot of the pieces that I read, doing research for this, were from like 2015. So it was talking more about like the women who were writing these, who were like just writing about like people as if they weren't people, like writing about men and the idea of them being gay, and not about just like gay characters who happen to be gay. So like one of the pieces that I found was a Mary Sue article back from 2015, and one of the interviewed people had said that the same people who write the MLM/Fics are the sort who ask real gay men invasive sexual questions and then treat them like cute pets more than real people, was sort of the gist. And I do like to think that maybe this has improved as time has gone on, but I'm not saying that it's exclusively untrue anymore. And so I don't think it's inherently a bad thing, like I've said, to write fics where, gay characters are the focus of the piece, so long as everyone involved is being treated like a real person and their sexuality or gender identity is not like the focus in a negative way. Like coming of age, like coming out stories, that's not the same thing. But like writing a story where you're relying heavily on exclusively stereotypes or infantilizing a character because of their sexuality or identity. So avoiding those sorts of things is important. And I will say that my basis of knowledge of what goes on right now is strictly from Archive of Our Own, which is a humongous fan fiction website. I have read fan fiction. I have at one point in life written fan fiction. I've got a whole video about, good things, bad things, different fan fiction websites. I can link it here. But in my experience and in the fandoms that I have, taken in media for, I haven't seen these issues, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. And I think that if they were to exist, it would be more likely on Wattpad or fanfiction.net, which are different. They're different fanfiction websites that I do not peruse. So if it exists there, I'm unaware of it. But I find that AO3, Archive of Our Own, at least the spaces I have been in, are not like that. But I'm not saying that it's not possible. But regardless, the biggest issue when it comes to slash fics is that if it were to be a case where, someone was fetishizing a gay character specifically, is people not listening? So, like that guy in the Mary Sue was saying, if you're being told that what you're writing is harmful, in any capacity, not just here, but if anybody is saying that what you're writing is harmful, then you should at least take a step back and make sure that, they don't have a point. Especially if it's a community that you're writing about, you really need to make sure that you are not offending people, even if your intentions are good. Because especially in this case, if you're writing gay characters and then you don't listen to real gay people, you don't care about representation, you are just romanticizing the idea of a gay character or, of gayness, queerness in general, and so in that case you are, in fact, fetishizing a community. So, if a woman were to write an M/M couple who is not canonically paired, but does it in a way that ensures character depth and that those characters have motivation and solid relationships and are real human feeling characters, as long as it's done with care, I don't think it's a bad thing. As long as we're listening to people and taking real people's advice into consideration, I don't think that that is necessarily bad. Just make sure you're doing research and you're listening, and I think that that's really the key here. Because while some people don't argue in good faith, I would say a majority of the time in cases like this, people probably are. So just be careful and keep your ears open. So let's take a bit of a turn and talk about the WLW, the Women Loving Women community. There's a very different kind of sexualization that happens in the WLW spaces than in the MLM ones. And I think we've seen this for a really, really long time. The kind of the trope, I guess you could say, of like people, specifically men, finding it very attractive when women kiss. So it's not that people are hating that, it's that they are taking the idea of women who are involved with women and making it about men. And also, I'm using the gender binary here because that's usually how it exists within these conversations, especially on the other side of them. But I want to acknowledge that, this is part of a bigger community issue, and so you've got I don't want to exclude like non-binary people or femme-presenting people or like trans women. Like this is all included. But as this conversation usually happens in the binary, I'm just going to focus there for now. Like the other aspects of the conversation, it has to be intersectional, and we have to consider all aspects and how it all weaves together, so I want to make sure we put that out there. And also, I am using the monogamy side of this. I'm not discrediting polyam people. Same argument, just make sure we acknowledge that all of these aspects are around. Okie dokie. Let us move on to the next point. We've seen making women loving women content related to men a lot in the adult film industry. I'm pretty sure the other word has problems with monetization, which I don't have because I'm a very small creator, but you never know in the future. So I'm just going to kind of use protected language on that. But most of the media that exists in the WLW spaces of the adult film industry are made for male pleasure as opposed to made for female enjoyment and watching and that sort of thing. There have been companies who have tried to combat this by making their own like female-driven, female-made content. Like Bellessa, I think, is one of them. There are others, but that's the one that comes to mind. And I'm not here saying that men can't watch that content, but it gets dangerous when you have a separation between adult films and reality. Like there's lots of stories of men trying to turn lesbians straight. It's just, it could be some twisted sort of logic of like, she hasn't met the right man, or like, it's kind of like the I can change him mentality. And I don't necessarily mean like if a woman was trying to change a gay man to be straight, but more like a heterosexual man or a man who likes women, but is just sort of awful. And a woman getting into that relationship and being like, I can change him. It's like, you can't. You really can't. And for the men who try to change lesbians, you can't. Please stop trying. There are other reasons that, you know, men are into lesbians or whatever, and I think a lot of it has to do with just like the fantasy around it and the power play, but that's not really the focus right now. What I want to talk about more is why that matters to this greater conversation. Most every woman knows the fear of walking alone at night, or how you need to cover your drink at a bar, or be careful of your words if you're talking to a man who's trying to pursue you. Queer people have to be even more careful. Either it ends up as some sort of challenge, like straight men to lesbians, or you have to fear for your safety if you end up with somebody who's homophobic and dangerous. There are so many different aspects of this conversation we could have, and dangerous stereotypes and ideas around the LGBTQIA individual groups, like bisexual people being greedy and promiscuous, or asexuality being some kind of illness that can be changed, or polyam people being like dirty cheaters or something like that. Sure, you could have a promiscuous bisexual person or a polyam person who cheats, but that's not because of their identity or sexuality, it's just because of the person, right? And promiscuity, by the way, is not a bad thing so long as it's like consensual and everyone's aware if there's more than one person involved in a relationship. Like, that's a whole other conversation, but you know what I'm saying. And much like our conversation earlier about the school shooter who was trans, we have to make sure that if an individual does, you know, cheat on a partner and they are bisexual or something, that doesn't reflect the community, it just represents the one person. Sexualizing queerness is inherently dangerous. It's what makes people think that teachers who are queer are going to hurt kids. It's what makes them fight against drag story hours and think that two women holding hands are going to pervert their child. Queerness is not a sexual thing. It's a human thing. It's about love and life and just existing. So this brings us to the part of the conversation that represents our writing and how we make sure that we're representing a community and not crossing over that line into fetishization. So I'm going to offer us five different ways that we can look at this. Number one, mingle. I know that sounds kind of silly, but the more LGBTQIA plus queer people that you meet, the more you'll know that you've only met one LGBTQIA plus person. Everybody is different, and even people within the same denomination of queerness are not going to be the same. Everyone has different experiences, different advice, different things that they might tell you to do, and the more people you talk to, the more human your writing can be. That's not just true in queerness, that's true in any kind of community. You should make sure you're understanding the people you're writing before you try to write them. 2, get sensitivity readers. I know this has been a bit of a debated topic for a while, but I think that there's a lot of value here. If you're talking to people and having people read your stuff who are of the community you're writing about, you can make sure you're not accidentally peppering in stereotypes or limiting people to parts of your story where you could have, more representation. Like, if you have a villain character who is queer, make sure you have other characters who are queer. If you kill off the only gay character, that's a problem. Diversity should add depth and realism, not just be around for social brownie points. 3, listen. I've said that a few times during this video, but that's really, really important. If people are telling you, whether it's a sensitivity reader or a beta reader or whatever, that you have issues, address them. And maybe they're not issues. Maybe one person has a problem and that's their problem, but it's more than likely that there could be something, especially if more than one person says it. So listen to what people are saying, take that advice, and then make your writing better. It's not like a finalization, If you make a mistake, that's okay. At least you're trying, but just fix it. It's not that big a deal. 4, if you don't think you can write respectfully, don't do it at all. I know that there are some people who would like to have all these diverse characters, but if you can't talk to people, do research, listen, write without stereotypes, then just write what you would write anyway. Write what you know, write your own community, whatever. It's better to not have that representation than to have harmful representation. And 5, let your queer characters be funny. Let them be villains. Kill them off if you want to. Just make sure that they're not the only ones. I, again, have said this many times throughout this video, but so long as we have characters who cover all different spectrums of types of character and types of person, then there's not an issue. Give them depth, make them the main character, make them the antagonist. There's nothing wrong with giving your queer characters diverse roles in a story, but making the sole trans character bad or killing off the lesbian character and it's the only one sends the wrong message. Sexuality and gender identity don't have to be the main points of interest in your characters. They can just be one facet of who a person is. Not every queer story has to be a coming-of-age, coming-out sort of story. It can just be a character who is bi, a character who is asexual. I think that that's something that we have issues with, is focusing only on what makes this character different, and that's not who people are. Lots of characters in your story could be queer if you wanted, without having it change the trajectory of your story. If your villain is gay, maybe your hero is too, and that doesn't have to affect anything. Or maybe the hero is 2 gay moms or polyam parents, I don't know. I'm not saying to paint your story with a rainbow brush, I'm just saying you don't need to limit yourself to one character because that's just sort of silly. There are so many kinds of people who exist out in the world, and I think to discredit that is just to make your story less deep than it could be and less real than it could be. But, like I said, if you're going to fall back on making these characters the evil, dead, funny one, then they better not be the only queer character. There are more queer characters in media now than ever. And that's great, but how wonderful would it be if I didn't have to come back here in 30 years and have this same conversation? How great would it be if there were just characters who happened to be queer in media and that it wasn't a thing that's worth writing articles and stories about? One day, maybe we'll have so much inclusion that we don't need to focus on Nick Offerman's character in The Last of Us and how big of a deal that was. That tomorrow is still many days away, but I think we can all do our part. Write more inclusively, write more thoughtfully, write so that future generations don't have to make this exact video. Happy Pride Month, everybody, and I hope that you enjoyed that video. I think I could have talked about that for a lot longer, but I wanted to make sure it was something that was easy and digestible. So if you're interested in more queer storytelling things, I'm going to be doing, I hope, a couple more this month, and then just beyond Pride, because I think it's important that we talk about these things more than one time a year. Other than that, I've got a lot of other things going on. Got my video about the writer's strike up. Got lots of things, my first line videos. If you have a first line from your writing that you want me to judge, there's a link down below. I've got a Legendborn video review coming up if it's not out already. Lots of other writing, reading sorts of things. If any of that sounds interesting, like this, subscribe, comment, hit the bell, whatever. All of those YouTuber things that whatever. But thank you again so much for being here and sticking around. And until next time, sweet dreams.